Hi, so you just unwrapped one of these for Christmas, one of these DSLR cameras, and then you're all excited, you want to take pictures with it, and then you look at all the buttons and dials and you're going, my God, how am I going to get this thing to work? Well, fear not, here are a few basic tips, hopefully to help you out. A couple of things. First, there's two dials at the top of the camera that are common to most of these cameras, and one of them's shaped like a hockey puck, and it's one that you twist to select different modes. And then there's another dial called the finger dial, or I don't know what it's called. I'm going to call it the finger dial. It's for the index finger because it's right near the shutter. And the way it works basically is that you select the mode to shoot in with the puck dial, and with the finger dial you select a parameter within that mode. So basically, going back to the puck dial, if we turn that to the green square, that's called full auto mode, which basically means that the camera is automatic at that point. It does all the thinking for you. It's just like a point and shoot. The only difference is you got to remember to take off the lens cap. But once it's on the green square, you just line up your subject, make it as big or small as you want, press the shutter, and you're done. So I can hear you thinking, why not just leave it on the green square all the time? Well, in many instances, using a different setting will give you a far better picture, and that's why those settings exist. So let me just talk about a couple of basic things about cameras, and that is that they are light control devices. Light comes into these things, and that's what gives you the picture. There are three ways that the camera controls the brightness of the picture. One is shutter speed, the length of time the curtain stays open. Another is aperture, which is the size of the window. Okay, and then the third one is ISO, or the sensitivity of the sensor. Now each of those factors, brightness factors, they have to be in balance with each other. If one of them goes up, another one has to come down. Let's talk about shutter speed first. Shutter speed, as I said, is the length of time that the curtain stays open. Obviously a fast shutter speed is a good idea for fast moving action, because any movement that occurs during the time the shutter's open is going to blur the picture. So you need a fast shutter speed for fast things, such as, let's say I want to take a picture of a hummingbird and it's flapping its wings at a gazillion times a second. I want to choose the fastest shutter speed I can, which for a lot of these cameras is 1/4000th of a second, which is very fast. Obviously during 1/4000th of a second not much movement can occur, so the hummingbird will just be suspended in air and frozen basically in time. Now, how do I do that? Well, I can set the puck dial. There's many ways of doing it actually, but one of them is to set the puck dial to TV, which in this case doesn't stand for television, it stands for time value, which basically means that's the length of time the shutter stays open. So once I set it to TV, now the finger wheel gives me the time value. Another way of saying this is that it's shutter priority, that setting. TV is shutter priority, which basically means that I set the shutter and that's the priority. The camera figures out the rest to give me the right exposure. If I want to take a picture of that hummingbird, the priority is I gotta have a fast shutter speed, so I set it to 1/4000th of a second. And the shutter numbers, in order to see them, I've got to slightly depress the shutter, and then at the bottom of the viewfinder I'll see these little numbers, and now I can select with the finger wheel, I can select the shutter speed that I want, and in this case that's 1/4000th of a second. Now they're whole numbers. It says 4000, which means it's the reciprocal of that, 1/4000th. If it says 250, it's 1/250th of a second. So once I select 4000, I just fire away at the hummingbird. Sometimes I may want to use a slightly slower shutter speed, for example, if I need more light, obviously, or if I want to blur certain things on purpose. Sometimes I may want to, if I'm taking a picture of that hummingbird, I may want to blur the wings, okay, but not the body. So, and by choosing a slightly slower shutter speed like 1/1000th or 1/800th, I should be able to achieve that. So hopefully that would be fast enough to freeze the body, but not fast enough to freeze the wings. So they would show a little bit of blur, which conveys a little bit of motion, which might be a desired effect. Of course, something has to be clear in the picture, so the bird itself would be clear, you know. Otherwise, if the whole thing's blurry, what's the point, right? But okay, so the second brightness factor is aperture. Shutter speed is the length of time the curtain opens. Aperture is the size of the window. Okay, so big window, lots of light. Small window, very little light. There's another factor that aperture controls that's very important, and that is depth of field. Whatever I allow my lens to focus on, these are autofocus lenses, so when I press the shutter down part way, the lens automatically, it focuses in on the subject, whatever I'm pointed at. Subject's clear no matter what, but what we're talking about with depth of field is what's behind the subject, the background, or in front of the subject, the foreground. Is it going to be clear or blurry? If it's blurry and only the subject's clear, that's a shallow depth of field. You might say, well, why would I want that? Why do I want to blur stuff? Well, it highlights the subject, because when people look at the picture afterwards, who wants to look at blurry stuff? I mean, they want, their eyes are drawn to the clear part, which is the subject, which is what you want them to look at. So it's a way of highlighting the subject. So to give it a shallow depth of field, I need a big aperture, and in order to give it a deep depth of field, a big depth of field, I need a tiny aperture. Okay, how does that work? Well, it's called the pinhole effect in optics, and what it means basically is that if you wear glasses, okay, and you take them off, if you squint, you can see better. So the blurry stuff is made a little less blurry by squinting. So when you put it to a small aperture, okay, the camera's squinting, so it's making the blurry stuff, what's behind the subject and in front of the subject, clearer. And that's how that basically works. How do I do that? One way to do it is I can set the puck dial to AV, which means aperture value, and now the finger wheel selects the aperture. Okay, so then I look through here and I just select the number that I want. Now the aperture numbers are a little bit confusing. They're also called F numbers, and because the bigger the number, the smaller the aperture. So the best way to think about it is that the bigger the number, the bigger the depth of field. Smaller number, small depth of field. So let's say I'm taking a picture of my cat at the end of my deck and I want the woods behind it to be all blurry. I want just the cat to be clear. So then what I do is I take the lowest number that I can get, because low number, small depth of field. In this case it's 3.5, and then I just press the shutter and I take my picture. Okay, the camera will figure out the shutter speed to complement that. So again, this is also called aperture priority, which means I set the aperture, that's the priority, the camera figures out the rest. Conversely, if I'm at the Grand Canyon and I want to take a picture of a person standing in front of the Grand Canyon, okay, I want the person to be clear and I want the Grand Canyon to be clear, so therefore I need a big depth of field, and I use a small aperture, like for example f/22. The F numbers range anywhere from 1.4 right up to about 30 something. Remember, the smaller the F number, the smaller the depth of field. Now there's a third factor, and that is the ISO of the camera. ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. Very much like your eye, the eye has what's called dark adaptation. So when you're in a dark room, your ISO in your eye dials up so you can see better in the dark room. And then when you go outside, you're blinded for a while because the ISO takes a little while to dial itself back down. Camera does the same thing. Low ISO is little sensitivity, high ISO, lots of sensitivity. So basically now the only problem with high ISOs, they make the picture a little more grainy. Okay, so you want to use, generally speaking, the lowest ISO that you can. So how do you select ISO? Well, you don't use the puck dial for that, you use an ISO button. This camera has an ISO button right here, so I just press that, and then with the finger dial I just select the ISO that I want. Now one of those ISO numbers range anywhere from 100 up to about 6400, and I can just choose whatever I like, for example. And usually people choose those depending on lighting conditions. If it's a bright sunny day, they'll choose 100. If it's a cloudy day, 400. For example, if it's indoors, 1600, maybe 3200, and so forth. There's also an auto ISO selection that you can choose, and if you choose the auto ISO, then given the lighting conditions, it may crank up the ISO automatically to give you the exposure that you need. Again, you just got to be careful. Sometimes it might be a little bit grainy, so you can experiment with these things. Now, okay, so we talked about aperture giving us depth of field that we want. We've talked about shutter speed and freezing fast action, and ISO, adjusting the sensitivity of the sensor depending on your lighting conditions, and that'll get you started in photography. Now, here is a shortcut mode that a lot of people who are kind of into photography, they kind of frown on these because it's a cheater's way of achieving some of these results. But I'll fill you in on this. Just don't tell anybody I told you. Okay, one of the settings on the puck dial here, it shows the head of a woman, and if you put it to that, that's basically portrait mode. Okay, and that means that the camera automatically is going to choose a big aperture to blur the background and the foreground to highlight the subject, and it's also going to choose a setting that softens the skin tones a little bit. Okay, and it's all done, and it's going to choose the complementing shutter speed and the complementing ISO to give you the right exposure, and it does it all automatically. So just set it to portrait mode, and then make your subject as big or small as you want. Take your shot, and you're a hero. Another mode on here, it shows a mountain with the sun behind it. Okay, that's landscape mode. That's the Grand Canyon mode, where you basically want the subject to be, you want your loved one to be in focus, you want the Grand Canyon to be in focus. Once again, small aperture this time, so everything's in focus, big depth of field, okay? And once again, it just does it all for you. Just make it as big or small as you want and shoot, presto. And then there's another setting on here, sports setting, shows an athlete, fast shutter speed. To get a moving athlete, you need a fast shutter speed to freeze them in time. Okay, and if you put it on sports setting, it'll choose the aperture and the ISO to complement the fast shutter speed. So it'll automatically give you that fast shutter speed. So you can use that for the Hummingbird too. I mean, the Hummingbird doesn't have to be playing a sport to use sports mode. Just go ahead and fire away. Cheap and easy, and but still very effective. So anyway, don't tell anybody.